All right, I'm back with the next titles on my list of 50 favorite horror movies of all time. And it's time to talk about Vincent Price again. So I'm picking up at number 33 with The House on Haunted Hill. Price plays a mysterious wealthy man who invites a group of people to spend the night at his mansion, and if they can spend the night, if they can stay there without losing their minds from terror, then they will get a big payday. So they take him up on it, they take him up on the bet, and naturally really weird things start to happen. Now, this movie is interesting because it is set in a house on the West Coast, and it's a very modern looking house. It doesn't look like haunted houses in the movies usually look. And that gives it a certain aura that's a little bit different from most movies like this. Of course, Price is excellent as always, and the people that he invites to his house do engage your sympathies. They are, if not the most interesting people, there's enough there for me to sympathize with them and care about them. And the twist is, of course, fascinating, changes the way, once the twist happens, of course, you look back on the rest of the film and you see it, you remember it a little bit differently now that you know what's really going on. And I, of course, am not going to spoil it for you. The House on Haunted Hill, I believe, is available on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it, you really should. Next, we have another one from the silent era from 1922. We have Destiny, or as it's called in Germany, Der Müde Tod, or Weary Death. That title was not going to sell with American audiences, so when it came over here, they called it Destiny. And this is a good example of fantasy horror, something that the Germans did really well during the silent era, but somehow it's something that we here in the US had never really mastered. Yes, we can do gothic horror. Yes, we can do psychological horror, but somehow fantasy horror and folktale horror, the closest we can, the closest I've seen to an English language film like this might be The Company of Wolves, and that, of course, is not U.S. That's a UK thing. So for some reason, we just aren't all that big into fantasy horror. But the Germans do it like nobody else. Another example that's going to come up further on the list in a later video is Faust from 1926. More on that later. But Destiny tells the story of a young woman whose lover dies unexpectedly, and she begs death to release him. And he tells her that he will only release her beloved if she can find another soul to take her beloved's place. And she is sent to three different eras of history, um, each one depicted in vibrant life. You have one sequence set in ancient China, another in the Arabian Nights, Middle East, and in each situation, she is faced with the prospect or has the opportunity to take some soul to replace that of her beloved, and it doesn't quite work out. So, this is a fascinating movie showing the way that German directors and set designers could bring these fantastic places to life. And of course, you have the dialogue with death, the conflict with death as the core idea. So, really worth a watch. I believe this is also on YouTube. And it really will just, the visuals along with the rather moving story, it will take your breath away. So that clocks in at number 32, Destiny or Der Mond Tod. A newer film, much newer, clocks in at number 31, and that is Prey, which is an entry into the Predator saga. And I'm not even all that much into the Predator saga. I didn't see this as being a Predator film so much as I saw it as yet another example of a period horror film. And again, I love period horror. But this is period horror with a difference because this is set in the 1700s in a Native American community. And the central female character is given the responsibility, or at any rate, she takes the responsibility of hunting this mysterious enemy that is threatening her community. And she is a fascinating character in that she goes through a lot of training and a lot of failures. She makes a lot of mistakes so that her eventual victory is very hard won in the way that I call the anti-woke grifters, they complain about, quote, girl bosses who defeat villains easily without even having to try and without even having any training. And this movie doesn't take that route. It actually lets you see this young woman develop into a warrior capable of defeating this seemingly indestructible enemy. And of course, it's also a movie with a kick butt heroine. So naturally, it's a movie after my own heart. So that's number 31. Number 30 is a movie significant to horror film history. Some people say that it is actually the first film that could be called horror. I'm not sure about that, but I've certainly read that description. It's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Vina and filmed in 1919. Not seen over here on these shores until the early 1920s, but it was made in 1919, so it's right on the cusp of the 1920s. And it tells a very compelling story about an old man, a carnival pitchman, who is exhibiting a sleepwalker who supposedly knows the answer to all your questions and can tell you your future. However, this young man, who really never has any will of his own or the ability to act on his own, at least in the first half of the movie, is compelled to commit murders. And it's a parable about the dangers of authority, some say, and the willingness, willingness is the wrong word, because part of the point is that the acts that this sleepwalking young man is driven to commit are things he would never do of his own will, that he wouldn't do them if he were awake. And of course, the idea of sleepwalking can be seen as a metaphor as well as a literal fact. So it's a fascinating story, but the reason that this movie has gotten so much attention is because it's just weird to look at. It is filmed in an expressionist style where everything is jagged, out of whack. It's like seeing a very dark acid trip. So if you're looking for anything literal or realistic in the visuals, you're not going to find it here. But what you will find is the fascinating figure of Conrad Veidt. He plays the sleepwalking young man, and he's just fascinating to watch. And also on YouTube, although you may not get the best print, but definitely recommended, particularly for those interested in exploring the history of the genre. At number 29, the third of the films in which Boris Karloff played Frankenstein's monster, Son of Frankenstein. It's not quite as good as the first two films, but it is well worth a watch. And the MVP, the star of this particular film, is Bela Lugosi, who plays Igor, the shepherd, supposedly with his neck broken. They tried to hang him for the crime of grave robbing, but somehow he survived. And so he has his neck kind of like that. And this is the first appearance of the Igor character. And Igor has been, and it's interesting that this and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari should be right there beside one another, even though Son of Frankenstein is a much more literal, realistic looking film. You do have Igor controlling the monster and using the monster as a kind of weapon to destroy the jury that convicted him and sent him to the gallows. So you got that going on, and at the same time, you have Basil Rathbone playing the son of Frankenstein, who discovers that his father's creature is alive and is interested in maybe figuring out how to bring the monster to a greater self-awareness and making him well, both mentally and physically. Doesn't, as you might expect, it doesn't work out, but Rathbone is very good. Lugosi is amazing. And Karloff doesn't really get to shine in this movie, but he does what he can in the role that made him famous. And you also have Lionel Atwill playing the one-armed inspector who was mangled by the monster as a child, has never forgotten it, and wants to make sure that the monster and nothing like the monster resurfaces in their town again. So, well worth a watch, a little bit longer. I know I keep saying well worth a watch. I need to find another phrase, but it's a little bit longer than Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. But it is a fascinating journey and a rather melancholy but fitting end for Karloff's run as the Frankenstein monster. I do not think the monster was ever quite the same after Karloff left the role. So this is actually the last although you do have Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. To me, it's really more of a Dracula film than a Frankenstein film. And you won't find any other Frankenstein films on this list except for Frankenstein and Bride further up, and then Guillermo del Toro's film, which I have to find a spot for. So that gets us clear through to number 29, and in my next video I'll pick up with number 28, moving closer, ever closer to the top. I'll see you next time.